Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan, encouraging you once again to read a book. And the book I want to talk about today is a Star Trek novel called Star Trek The Next Generation, Takedown, written by veteran Star Wars writer John Jackson Miller. I met Miller just this last year at Planet Comic-Con, and he talked to me a little bit about his the trilogy that he's also written now called Prey, so he's getting hip deep into Star Trek. This came out last year for the 50th, and this is about Klingon politics with the Federation, and this is the kind of lead-in novel, apparently, to a degree, although I can't imagine what this will end up having to do with this now that I've read it, but he told me that this was, of course, not necessary to read in order to read his trilogy, but that there's a little bit of lead-up stuff, and this is his first novel for Star Trek. So I want to start off by saying that I've never talked about a Star Trek novel on the channel before. I have read a few here and there. I'm starting to realize that I've read more than I even realized I had as I'm starting to get into these, and I'm seriously, after this read, considering really kind of dipping my feet into the Star Trek book world and getting into this continuity a little bit, because as I'm doing some research, I'm realizing that a lot more of this all counts together and is continuous within itself than I realized. Of course, it's not continuous with screen Star Trek like Star Wars tends to be, but it's, especially post-Nemesis, everything seems to count, and I thought there were just like pockets of continuities where certain writers would kind of have their own, or you'd have certain pockets of writers with their own continuities, and I found a couple of really nice lists and flowcharts giving you an idea of what the reading order should be and how these things connect with each other, and it's overwhelming if you were going to really immerse yourself, because there's so much of it. There's the IKS Gorkon series, and there's the Titan series, and there's the Starfleet Corps of Engineers, and there's Star Trek Next Generation novels, and DS9, and Voyager, and Enterprise, and TOS, and all these things continue to be made, and of course with the Enterprise and TOS, that stuff's not going to be related all that much, I'm sure, to what's going on in the 24th century stuff post-Nemesis, but it all kind of counts, and it all gets referenced, and there's a lot of stuff that I would have loved to have seen in Star Trek canon that I am starting to see in some of this, and I have to admit I'm getting a little bit taken in by it, and my hang-up has tended to be if it's not part of continuity, it messes with my trivia brain. I kind of pride myself on my Star Trek knowledge. I like to, it's a thing I used to kind of work on a lot. I used to run a Star Trek club. I did a lot of Star Trek trivia games and things to keep me and my crew up on our Star Trek knowledge, and I always stayed away from Star Trek novels, or I didn't read them a lot. I mean, like I said, I've read some, but I for the most part stayed away from them because I didn't want my head to get gummed up with stuff that doesn't count, and inevitably you get sequels to episodes and things that end up being interesting to the point where you wish they counted. I have this with Star Trek Continues, the fan film series, where they'll do a sequel to something like they did with Apollo, with Who Mourns for Adonis, and I'll wish that was canonical, and so it's difficult not to think of those things moving forward whenever you're considering those episodes. And so anyway, now that I'm not doing a formal Star Trek club anymore, and I don't have to worry, too much about that. I really kind of want to look into some of this stuff now, because there is, of course, no canonical Star Trek moving past the last TNG movie, past Nemesis, and now these novels can do whatever they want to. They don't have to worry about being about contradicting anything that might come out later, or being too large and grandiose and affecting the status quo of the continuity as it is in the films and movies. And so this is for all intents and purposes what Star Trek is after Nemesis, or the closest to that we're going to get. And so, even though it doesn't technically count, I can look at it as its own world, where all of the stuff on screen counts with it, but it is its own thing moving forward. And so I don't know how much I'm going to look into pre-Nemesis, but really everything after the you know, we made the Star Trek 2009 film, some of that stuff I'm kind of interested in. So Takedown takes place in 2285, which is some 7 or 8 years after Nemesis, and this is informed by a lot of stuff that's been going on just before it, specifically the Titan series and Typhon Pact, and Ezri Dax and her starship. I don't know where exactly that happens, and Starfleet Corps of Engineers. But the nice thing is, I don't have to read any of that stuff in order to read this, and I think Miller does a really good job of recapping the things that need to be recapped without going for pages and pages about it, and he just gives you a really good sense of what the status quo is right now. And so I think this is potentially a really good introduction to that stuff, a really good jumping on point, without having to necessarily go to all of that stuff. And I think if a person wanted to, I think he could read this and then keep buying novels after this and have a really good sense of what's going on. One thing that's kind of annoying for me is I actually own a book that I haven't read yet that informs this a lot, apparently. And I forget what it's called, but Dayton Ward, who's an acquaintance of mine, has and he's been writing Star Trek books for years. I bought one of the Typhon Pact books from him that is about an Andorian incident, not the Andorian incident from Enterprise, but there's a major thing that happens with the Andorians in that informs this a lot. And it's funny because when I met Miller, and I'm going to try to have him on a show at some point. He and I talked about doing a podcast. He was a lot of fun to talk to. Like I said, really knows the Star Trek. And Miller brought up that you don't necessarily have to read this in order to read these, but that this apparently informs these. And again, I can't imagine how exactly these end up being related now that I've read this. But anyway, but I was a little bit surprised that he didn't mention Typhon Pact when I talked to him, because that seemed kind of more important than anything, because that seems to be the big status quo of the world, of the universe right now. So the idea is you have this sort of Axis powers of planets that are anti-Federation, that aren't part of the Federation, and species that have gone to war with Starfleet. And so the Breen are there, the Romulans are there, the Zenkethi are there. There's a number of these species, and there's not a big giant war with them right now, but everybody's just sort of, you know, on edge, and anything could happen at any moment. And I don't think it's quite a Cold War, but you basically have like an anti-Federation now, which makes a lot of sense, and I like that idea a lot. And so now I'm very interested in reading Typhon Pact and going backwards. But anyway, so what happens in this book is Riker gets called up to go to a conference with 4 worlds from the Federation and 4 worlds from the Typhon Pact. And nobody going there has any idea what the conference is about or why they're having to meet. And when they get there, but each was invited by another race, and they all think that it was another race's idea. When they all get there, they realize that none of them actually invited any of the others, and there seems to be some 9th party that nobody knows anything about. And we see them start to talk, and then we just immediately cut to Riker going aboard Captain Ezri Dax's ship, which, Captain Ezri Dax, I don't love that. She's fine in this, but I still have my reservations about, and this isn't a Miller problem, because he's working with the continuity that the pre-established stuff. So Ezri Dax is a starship captain. She has her own ship. Some of the characters on her ship are kind of interesting. Her doctor is Simon Tarses, the 1/4 Romulan from the Drumhead, which I think is kind of fun. But there are, I don't know, I have my reservations about whether or not she has the temperament to be a starship captain, and even with some of the things that she's thinking and doing in this, she doesn't seem to cut the mustard, or I wouldn't think that she would, but Miller does the best he can with that. Anyway, so Riker ends up showing up on her ship, and there's this top secret mission that they have to do, and he seems to be acting a little bit odd, but we are constantly questioning whether or not it's strange, like, alien influence type behavior, or if it's just there's this top secret mission and he can't tell anybody why he's doing the things that he's doing. And that's a thing we do in Star Trek all the time, where you have. And by the way, Riker is an admiral now, which adds to that, because of course he's the ranking officer, and he's got that compartmentalized thing where he's not allowed to talk, or allegedly he's not allowed to talk about everything that's happening, and Dax needs to just follow orders. But of course, she can only do that to the point where he doesn't seem to be risking, putting her crew at undue risk, and of course eventually that ends up happening. And this is a story we tell quite a bit, but I think Miller does a pretty good job of making that pretty fresh, especially because he's constantly giving me clues about this mystery. So one of the big clues is right away, the first thing Riker does when he gets there is he sets up his quarters in the holodeck, and he makes his quarters look just like his office on the Titan. And everybody is talking about how that's kind of an odd thing to do, and nobody's ever done that before. But it doesn't necessarily mean there's anything wrong with them, especially because later on, Picard, who ultimately ends up in this kind of cat and mouse chase with Riker, is thinking, "Oh wow, that's a really good idea. I wish I had thought of that. Having your quarters when you go to another ship like that, on the holodeck, and making it look like home." And but increasingly, things aren't adding up, and there are all these interesting clues about what exactly is going on. And Riker is a weird number of steps in this three-dimensional chess game he's having with various members of the Typhon Pact, including the Breen. He's several steps ahead, and we're constantly questioning why he's able to do that. So it's not the kind of book where we don't get those answers until the very, very end. We finally, it's sort of like the thing in Winter Soldier with Hydra, where we finally get that answer around, that's kind of the second act plot point, and then we get to our big third act denouement, and that's kind of what happens here. If you really know your TNG, you may call what is happening much earlier even, than it's finally revealed. I did. Now, I was just thinking of it as one possibility, but then when it was finally revealed, I was surprised that I was right. And the only potential problem with that for me is I wasn't sure if I liked that I was able to call that, just because I thought of it as, oh, it'd be weird if it was that, and then it was that, and there was a part of me that wanted it to be something like bigger and more and grander in scope, and yet once we get to the end of the book, I think I'm kind of glad that we didn't go too far with it, with the premise that he has. And I think, again, and I don't want to reveal what it is, but I think Miller does a pretty good job in balancing that, in making it feel like it could be this really big, grand thing, and then it all adds up at the end, and it's not what it's not what you were supposed to be led to believe, but the clues did kind of add up to sequel to a particular TNG episode. So this ultimately, at the end of the day, is a two-part episode before it's an epic film. And I think that's fine, because, first of all, it's his debut work. He's obviously doing something much more grand scale once he gets to Prey here, and he's it would have been, with the premise of what it ultimately ends up being, in the episode it ends up kind of being a direct sequel to, it would have been kind of preposterous and I think a little self-indulgent if he made it, again, too grand in scope, and if status quo was mixed up too much by the alien influence that it ends up being, and that's all I'll say about that. One of my big takeaways from this was these are, if you really know your Star Trek and you really want to brush up on your Star Trek, this is a wonderful way to do that, because it's informed by so many different episodes, and you're reminded of so many different things that even though it's not canonical, it helps you really brush up on your canonical Star Trek stuff. And I've read other books that will go on too long in recapping episodes and things. I will say, you don't have to know any Star Trek novels whatsoever to read this, but you probably should be at least an intermediate TNG person. Like you should probably at least know that series fairly well. It is also informed by some Voyager, by some Deep Space Nine, even toward the end a little bit by some TOS. But none of those are things that you have to have in order to look at this, even with Ezri Dax, I don't think. I think it opens it up a little bit more, and there's stuff that you would appreciate more if you had that. But you absolutely probably should be a pretty solid TNG veteran before you take a look at this. But I think that's about the only real prerequisite. And like I said, I appreciate that he doesn't go on for pages and pages reminding me about something that happened that informs this or informs somebody's thought process. He'll just spend like a short paragraph on it, and that's never intrusive, and it's always really natural. I should say Miller's prose is really good. He's got an excellent voice for all these characters. The internal monologues sound like these characters to me. The new characters or characters I wasn't familiar with or that aren't on screen came alive for me. There's a really interesting Romulan character in this who's kind of a washed out senator who's really pathetic, and it's an interesting juxtaposition because you of course don't usually see that with a Romulan, and he's kind of the Barclay of Romulans, and I really liked that. And I found him really interesting, and like I said, he came alive for me. Pretty minimal description. I feel like a lot of Trek novels, this is trying to play an episode in your mind before it's trying to be a really literary experience. And I don't say that as a criticism of it. It's really fun, light reading, and I think that works just fine. There are, as a literary piece, there are a couple of things I might have done a little bit differently with it. I might have not gotten back into Riker's head at all once he gets out of that the Conference of Eight, because we're not allowed to know what exactly is going on with him, and so he's still looking like our central protagonist, while we're not really allowed to know everything that's going on in his head. And I tend to have reservation about, I tend to resist my protagonist keeping things from me, and so I think I would have switched it to Ezri Dax and let her have some kind of a character arc, and then at the end we kind of discover the arc Riker has had, or allow us to know the big mystery much earlier and make it not a mystery. And this is the kind of thing that is easier to do on television because we're not in anybody's heads. So I might have either kept this in other people's consciousnesses in internal monologues, and kind of kept us more distanced from Riker and never jumped back to him into his head, or let this be a character piece for Riker and how this alien influence affects him. Again, I don't want to give too much away, but I don't know how to talk about this without mentioning that there is an alien influence at work, and that there's a really good treatise on alien influence in Star Trek in this, and that's one of the things that I like a lot about it and want to recommend it for too, that we talk about just how often this happens in Star Trek, and how this is kind of a standard common event that ends up happening, especially with starship captains, and that Riker ends up being kind of in, well, just Starfleet officers in general, and Riker ends up being kind of in this special club, like power play is evoked, and of course the Borg taking over Picard, turning him into Locutus is invoked, and there are a number of those, and even some more obscure ones. And and I enjoyed it for that a lot. So anyway, at the end of the day, I liked this quite a bit. It ended up being more of a standalone, one-and-done story that is, for the larger universe, probably skippable, and I wasn't really expecting that, but I'm still glad I read it. And if you like Riker, I especially suggest you read this, because it's interesting seeing what happens to a guy as sure of himself and such a masterful tactician and a good diplomat when he gets into this particular scenario. I'm looking forward to reading more of Miller. I want to read some of his other work. I'd like to check out his Star Wars, and Eric says nice things about his Iron Man. So anyway, eventually I will probably try to have him on the channel, and I'll talk to him a little bit about some of this stuff. And I'm reading another Star Trek novel right now by Peter David, so I'll probably tackle that down the road, and then I'm going to jump into Prey. So anyway, like I said, if you're a Riker person, if you're a TNG person, this is probably worth picking up, and it's a fast read. It's a good page turner. It took me maybe 4 or 5 hours to get through. It's about 350 pages. And anyway, that's about all I have to say about it. Everybody, thanks as always for watching. Sure appreciate it. And I'll see you again next time when I recommend and discuss another book here on Read a Book. In the meantime, go on and do that. Read a book. See you later, folks.